Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to cover a topic that I made a reference to a couple videos ago. We were looking at some trigger code, very simple code, but one of the things I'd mentioned is that we don't want to have a lot of code in a trigger, and there's a better way to structure our code, and that is the use of trigger handler. So that's going to be the topic that we're diving into today. My name is John Dillon. On this channel, we cover all sorts of topics around Salesforce development, specifically Apex and Flow. So let's just jump right in. So here's the trigger that we wrote to handle a specific use case that we were working on, a requirement that was part of our system. As we can see, it's very simple, but we don't want to put a lot of code in a trigger. A couple of reasons for that. One is if there's anything that we use, that we write that might be reusable, if it's sitting here within the trigger itself, we don't have access to it from anywhere else. It just runs within the trigger. Probably the other reason is that even though right now this is a small amount of code, with any system over time we always add more and more to it, and this trigger could become really unwieldy and hard to maintain. If we break it off and maybe break it apart into a class or several classes, we have a lot of options for flexibility and being very organized. Plus, a lot of times in our system, there's common things that we want to happen across all of our triggers, and rather than copying and pasting code into the trigger code itself, we can just have a class or a set of classes manage that. So what we're going to do today is just show how to refactor this trigger into a trigger handler. So first thing we're going to need is a class that will be the trigger handler. And I always try to keep my naming very simple for these things. So we're just going to call our class account trigger handler. And we want to basically move all of this functionality into that class. And I'm going to copy it just so we can kind of keep the code in both places and delete as we need. If that doesn't make sense, hopefully it will by the end of the video. So we're going to make a public method. And this does not need to return anything, so it's going to be void. And we're doing this on a before update. So I'm going to you can name our method anything, but I'm just going to call it before update since that's the context that we're dealing with. You may have other naming conventions. There's lots of different ways to slice this, but that's what I'm going to do for today. Now, one of the things I like to have as a rule for my handlers is I want them to stay away from trigger specific code. Even though they're being used by triggers, sometimes we want to test them outside of a trigger context, but so the way to extract this, and this is all part of the refactoring, right? Refactoring means, taking code from one state to another, and usually in a gradual sense, so that you can kind of check as you go that you're making the right decisions. So the decision here is trigger.new is a list of accounts. So I'm going to just assume that we're passing that in from whoever's calling us. And I could use the syntax I used before, or I could be more formal and say, hey, we're passing in a list of accounts. Either of those two things were exactly the same. So it's just a syntactic preference. So this is probably a little more formal for what we're dealing with here, because trigger.new is a list of accounts. So since accounts is being passed in, I no longer need it here. So let me just delete that. And what we're going to do is loop through the accounts that get passed into us, do the same functionality we did before, and exit. So I think we're all done here. We save that. Now, how do we access this from the trigger? So what we essentially want to do is make an instantiation of this. And then we want to use it. And we could do a little test up front to say, is this in the before and is this in the update? To keep this simple, because I know this trigger is only running on before update, I'm going to skip that. But we do need to pass trigger.new into it. So here's how we do that. So handler dot. So remember, I named the method before update, and we just want to pass in trigger.new, and the rest of this can go away. So what this does is this keeps our trigger code nice and clean and fairly simple. We can put all of our complexity into this class, and that should work. So we can either test this in the UI, or even better, let's open up the unit test that we created earlier. And when we run the test, we can see it's successful. So we preserved all the functionality. Our unit tests confirmed that. And what we did is we rewrote our trigger so it's a little more succinct. And the complexity is pushed off to a class. And then as this complexity grows over time, we won't be polluting our trigger. Classes give us a lot more flexibility and maintainability. We can create multiple classes. We can do all sorts of things with classes that we cannot do with triggers. So I hope this helps. I hope this makes sense. A lot of the code that we do on this channel is just assuming that we're working with handlers. So if there were any questions about that, hopefully this clears that up. If you have any questions about this or why we do this, or if you have a better way, maybe you've got a pattern that you prefer over this, feel free to let me know in the comments. If you're new to Apex, one great starting place is to learn what SOQL is about. We didn't do it in this video, but we oftentimes, almost always, we're dealing with SOQL, the query language, in one form or another. I've got a free resource that you can grab. The link is at the bottom of the screen or in the description of this video, and it's a crash course. It gives you some practical hands-on applications of SOQL. Again, it's a free download, so feel free to grab that. And if you haven't seen the original, where we built this trigger code from, the link to that video is right here. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next time.